Alrighty then. Howdy. Welcome to question and answer number 123. I am your host, Panyobasa. And I have to admit, I'm feeling kind of hibernating today. It's like winter weather has kicked in. And also, I started a new job like 2 weeks ago. And I'm working nights pretty much, like from 5 to 3. I still haven't fully like adjusted to the whole time change and everything. So bear with me. I got some coffee here, the beverage, which I should hold up here. The beverage, remove the paper umbrella. And you guys should, some people may not like me drinking during these Q&As, but I mean, the beverage is good. It kind of coats the throat so I can talk for 3 hours straight. And just pray that I don't start eating in the middle of these Q&As, because I like talk with like food in my mouth, and it's like stuff gets stuck between my teeth and all that. It's not good. So just count your lucky stars that I'm just drinking stuff. And we've got kind of a moderate middle path number of questions today. And so I suppose I should just dive right in. Just wade into this. And the first question is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, recently a Christian friend has lent me a book on the biblical commentaries of medieval German mystic Meister Eckhart. And one thing that struck me is that he would not even admit that God was good. Eckhart's position was that anything that was good can become better, and whatever may become better may become best. God cannot be referred to as good, better, or best because he is above all things. If a man says that God is wise, the man is lying, because anything that is wise can become wiser. And so anything that a man might say about God is incorrect, even calling him by the name of God. God is super essential nothingness and transcendent being, beyond all words and beyond all understanding. The best a man can do is remain silent, because anything he prates on about God, he is committing the sin of lying. The true master knows that if he had a God, he could understand. See, the true master knows that if he had a God, he could understand. He would never hold him to be God. To me, this sounds an awful lot like the doctrine of no view in the Atthakavagga. Thoughts? Yeah, well, there's a number of things I can say. I mean, even for Meister Eckhart to say God is super essential nothingness or transcendent being, I mean, that would be the sin of lying too, I guess, according to him. I mean, it's not really lying, because, at least from a Buddhist point of view, in order to lie, you have to have the deliberate intention to deceive. So people who really do believe that God is like Santa Claus sitting up on a throne in heaven with like a white suit instead of a red one, and angels for helpers instead of elves, and not quite so jolly. I mean, if they really believe that, then they're not lying, even if what they're saying isn't technically true. But let's just scroll up to the top of this long question here. Yeah, Meister Eckhart, he would be in a very short list of Christians that I know of, that I'm familiar with, that could possibly be very spiritually advanced, possibly even fully enlightened from a Buddhist point of view. Like St. John of the Cross also obviously would be on that very short list. Those would be like the top 2, I think. There'd be some like Greek Orthodox monks also who were very wise and wrote, along these same kind of lines. And what Meister Eckhart is talking about is also, I mean, his predecessor would be the pseudo-Dionysius, who wrote the Mystical Theology, which is very short. You can download it for free on the internet. And, the Mystical Theology is like no words can apply to God. And it's like trying to stick tape onto a powdered donut. It just doesn't stick. It's just not going to work. It just does not work that way. God is completely off the scale, beyond duality, beyond symbols, and words are symbols. So to say that God cannot be referred to as God, as good, well, I mean, I don't think Meister Eckhart was adopting the position that I'm going to adopt right now, but I do think that like the Hindu conception of Krishna as just the highest God, an avatar, a human manifestation of the highest God, with Krishna being a rascal. You know, he was not particularly virtuous in an ethical kind of sense. And in a way, it's more fitting that like the highest God isn't just going to be a God of good. He's going to be a God of good and bad and everything in between. He's going to be a God of everything, which includes lying and killing and like fornicating and all the rest of it. That would be the highest God. In a way, it's sort of like in Gene Wolfe's the Book of the New Sun, the savior of the world, you know, sort of like the second coming of Christ, starts off as a torturer. You know, it's like he has to have all of the dark side as well as the light side sort of encapsulated into one person so that he can really be a representative of humanity. But I don't think Meister Eckhart was talking about that. That's just a digression. Very first question, I'm already digressing. I'm digressive AF sometimes. So, yeah, I mean, I think he gets a little too rational when he's talking about how good cannot be referred to as good because anything that is good can get better. I mean, that's just kind of, it's unnecessary. It's just nothing, no kind of label, no kind of symbol will stick to the absolute. Something that is totally beyond samsaric phenomena. It's like the Kantian thing in itself. You cannot describe the Kantian thing in itself. And God would be the Lulu of all Kantian things in themselves. So, yeah, I do think that Meister Eckhart, whether he was influenced by like the Pseudo-Dionysius and earlier Christian mystics, or whether he just had the talent, you know, the parami from a Buddhist point of view, that he just discovered this stuff by himself, for himself, you know, through his own meditative practice, contemplative practice. I don't know. I don't know nearly as much about Meister Eckhart as I know about St. John of the Cross. But he would have made an excellent Buddhist. So I'm just going to move on to the next question from Philalethes, which is, I feel the best way to achieve realization, as opposed to book learning, of the above is through the establishment and abiding in of jhanas. But of course, I have never even reached first jhana. What do you think? Well, I mean, going with the orthodox interpretation of the four jhanas, all of them are superhuman mental states, even the first jhana where you're still thinking. So getting back to my hypothesis or theory or lame idea or whatever, I think that the four jhanas were originally just the four stages of meditation. And first jhana, where you're still thinking, is, I mean, even a beginner, if he's meditating correctly, would be at the first stage. So that's just a niggle, I guess, maybe even another digression. See, through the establishment and abiding in of jhanas, the best way to realize, yeah, if you're able to do that. Not everybody can attain higher contemplative states, though. Especially in the West, compulsive thinkers and all that. It's not for everybody. Like in Buddhism, you've got thousands of monks who are diligently striving to attain higher contemplative states, second, third, fourth jhana, and most of them can't do it. Even though they're trying, they're dedicating themselves to it, they can't do it. So on the bright side, it's not really necessary, not for everybody. Some people can become enlightened without jhana, like the dry-visioned arhats that I mentioned at the beginning of the previous Q&A. And I think most enlightened Westerners who at least are extremely highly advanced, they are the dry vision kind, because most Westerners don't dedicate their lives to cultivating these advanced contemplative states, and they're much more likely to become enlightened like accidentally. Like Eckhart Tolle, he didn't even have any meditative practice, and then he just gets slammed through some existential crisis into this higher state of consciousness. So I do think that probably most Western sages are dry vision, and they really haven't attained jhana. So nevertheless, the Buddha would not have taught jhana if there wasn't a good reason for it. And I do think that if you can completely still your mind so that you're wide awake and your mind is just clear like glass, that you're much less likely to get distracted by samsaric phenomena which keep you stuck in samsara. At the very least, you get this insight that when you're not thinking anything, you're still wide awake. In fact, you're more awake than when you are in your normal waking state of consciousness. And of course, you get this insight into, there is something deeper than just this phenomena, these forms that distract almost everybody all the time. We think this is reality. So, let's see here. What's the question again? I feel the best way to achieve realization as opposed to book learning of the above, which I think he's talking about Meister Eckhart, and you can't really name the absolute or talk about the absolute, is through the establishment and abiding in of jhanas. But of course, I've never even reached first jhana. What do you think? Yeah, I mean, if you can attain jhanas, that is best, but it's not the only possible way. And so just do the best you can. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. Also from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, I'm going to check, make sure we're recording here. Yeah, we are. Philalethes says, is moving to Burma still the most reliable way to pursue genuine Orthodox Buddhism? I feel that for the unenlightened, travel can disturb one's Dhamma practice in many subtle ways that might be hard to detect. For example, it can boost the ego or sense of self, and so can being a foreigner among natives. Well, I mean, there's a plus and a minus to everything. There's a light side and a dark side to everything. And so traveling to a foreign country, you've got certain hassles. You got to learn a new foreign language. You might have visa hassles. I mean, you might have weird tropical diseases, this kind of a thing. There's going to be a certain culture barrier, but that can actually be to your advantage. So travel can disturb one's Dhamma practice, but also it kind of gets you out of ruts. It puts you into like this stranger in a strange land kind of phenomena where, I mean, you become as a little child again. You're seeing everything as for the first time, because a lot of it you really are seeing for the first time. So I wouldn't be too worried about that, because there's a trade-off. There's going to be pluses and minuses, and they balance out in the long run. So staying at home has its pluses and minuses, and traveling to some tropical Asian Buddhist country also has pluses and minuses. But that's not really the question. Is moving to Burma still the most reliable way to pursue genuine Orthodox Buddhism? That depends on the political situation. I really am not sure about the political situation in Burma. I know that most of the foreigners in Burma have fled. If they haven't been kicked out, they have left voluntarily after the military coup and all that. So you'd have to check into that. You might try to contact one of the Mahasi centers or Pa'auk in Burma and just ask them, what is the situation for foreign yogis in your country now? And they might say, well, it's very difficult. You might want to try something else, in which case you might be better off going to some remote area of Sri Lanka where there is a resurgence of a forest tradition there. Also, there's more of a forest tradition in Thailand than probably there ever was in Burma. But the thing is, go to a remote area. Just living in a remote area amongst rustic people, subsistence farmers, hillbillies, does have its advantages. For one thing, you're much less likely to get spoiled rotten by relatively wealthy Asian spiritual materialists trying to get themselves into heaven by just offering you all kinds of stuff which does happen. It happens in Burma a lot. So I think you could still do well, especially if the political situation in Burma is just like apocalyptic or something. You might try finding some relatively remote forest monastery in Sri Lanka or Thailand that's strict. And there are strict monks in Thailand and strict monks in Sri Lanka, although in Sri Lanka you might really have to do some searching to find one. So yeah, I mean, the situation in Burma, especially the political situation, the situation of foreigners living on visas in Burma, I mean, that's kind of a roll of the dice, I guess. I'm not exactly sure what the situation would be with regard to that. So you'd have to investigate that. And if it looks like Burma really is not going to work out for you, then I'd go for, some remote, like northern Thailand or like the mountains of central Sri Lanka or something. In America, I mean, you could be a monk in America. That was my original plan. I was originally ordained in California, but America's got its own problems. I mean, asceticism is practically illegal in America. I mean, you can't even just build a little shack like you're supposed to, according to the ancient texts, because there's building codes. There's all these codes and everything. I mean, you could live in a tent, I guess. There's no codes for tents. And I mean, you can't really live the lifestyle of an ancient Indian monk as described in the texts, the role models in the text. You can't live like them because you're living in a non-Buddhist, post-modern Western country. So definitely anyone who's going to be ordained, I would highly recommend they spend at least a few years, preferably like 5 years at least, in a traditional Theravada Buddhist Asian country, just so that you can like feel what it was like for the early monks. Sleep under a tree, walk through the village for alms in the morning, that kind of thing. That is much more difficult to manage in the West, although it has been done. So I think I answered that question. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Thermal Squid. And technically, I have a confession to make. This first question from Thermal Squid was technically the first question chronologically that I received for this Q&A, but it's kind of a morbid, grotesque kind of question. I didn't want to start off the Q&A discussing something really morbid. And so I kind of bumped him down to second place, just so I wouldn't be starting the Q&A with this question, which is as follows. Thermal Squid says, what is the most painful or grotesque thing you've ever experienced? Perhaps something that sticks around in your mind today or is remembered viscerally. Yeah, there are a few, I have to admit. And really the first image that popped up in my mind when I read this question was I was walking in southern Burma. People have asked me about like the one person I think might be fully enlightened. Like if I've ever met someone I think might be fully enlightened, I would say, possibly the most likely possibility would be Shui Umin Seattle. And on the occasion when I was walking from my monastery to Shui Umin's monastery in Mon State during the hot season, he would stay at this certain monastery in the hills for the hot season because the weather was more comfortable there. We're walking along with this guy who's guiding me there. I'd never been there before. And off in the distance, I see this dog that has like this pink plastic, like a cast on its leg, its front leg. And it's just standing there watching me. And I was thinking, that's nice. I mean, in Burma, dogs are just disposable. A lot of them don't even have owners. They're just sort of like feral pariah dogs. And so somebody actually took care of their dog and put like this big cast on him. And then I got closer and I could see the look on the dog's face, and he's just kind of looking at us with this kind of hopeful, pleading look on his face. And I realized that he didn't have a cast on his leg at all. It was just like the skin had all just like peeled off and it was all swollen up, probably with gangrene or something. And I mean, that is the plight of dogs and cats throughout much of this world. I mean, the dogs and cats in America, you know, like Safi back there's got her little cozy cave, and you know, they eat as much as they want. They get chicken scraps and stuff. You know, they've got it made. They got love. They're clean. They get sick. They get medicine. Not in Burma. I mean, there's stories like one time I was going for alms round in Rangoon, and there's this dog kind of staggering towards me, and I get close enough to see that it had been chopped in the head, and there was actually a hole going through its skull, like its brain was exposed to air. So that dog wasn't going to last very long. But also, I mean, you see stuff in Burma that you generally do not see in the West. Like one time I was invited to somebody's house. I go to their house, and there was a female relative, maybe 40 years old, sitting in a chair, and she was clearly insane. I mean, she had like a big open sore on her nose that caused me to think maybe it was like syphilis or something, but who knows? It might be that she just like fell down onto her face and gashed her nose up. But I mean, she was just like, she had like this little fan, like one of those collapsible kind of fans. She's just like slapping the arm of the chair pretty much the whole time I was there. And the family just very patiently, you know, they're making sure she's got everything she needs, and you know, but still just, it was sort of like being in a mental hospital where you've got someone who's just completely out of it. You know, obviously they're, you know, just over the deep end, and just kind of their face is sort of grotesquely marred in a way. And you're just thinking about like the family. I mean, in Burma, you just can't just ship off some family member to an institution. I mean, family first. It's like you take care of them. You know, they're like crapping on themselves. They're completely out of their head. That's just your cross to bear, so to speak. That's your duty as family. And that's the way it was in the West up until modern times. Or one time, I was just going for alms through the village, this village in central Burma, subsistence farmers mostly. And I see a man leading what looked like a teenage boy by the hand. And this teenage boy just did not have a face. He had like elephant man disease. It was just all like lumps. You know, it's like he couldn't see. There was like no eyes. If there were eyes, they were covered up by these folds of, you know, deformed flesh. And that was another case of, I mean, you don't just send them to an institution. You don't send them to a high class surgeon. I mean, they're subsistence farmers living in a fourth world country. So they're just stuck with that. I've seen people with leprosy. I've had people with leprosy put food into my bowl. So, yeah, I couldn't really pick a first place. Although the first image that popped into my mind when Thermal Squid asked this question, and I read it for the first time, was that dog with the swollen pink front leg that I thought was a plastic cast. And it warmed my heart that some Burmese person actually took the trouble of sending their dog to a vet and getting a cast put on his broken leg, and then getting closer and realizing that was no cast. That dog was doomed. So I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's second question, which is there any merit in getting hooked on crack in an inner city dumpster chanting mantras? Well, it depends on your mental states whether you're even going to get any good karma, kusala karma, from chanting mantras. But even if you do get some merit for chanting mantras, the demerit of getting loaded on crack in an inner city dumpster is going to more than compensate the other way. In Buddhist ethics, there is no just clear demarcation between black and white. Any action that an unenlightened person does is bound to be a shade of gray. It's going to be a mixture of good and bad, skillful and unskillful. I think a lot of people in the West, they're just kind of conditioned by like Christian ethics, where something is either right or wrong. God says this is right, so if you do it, it's right. And if he says don't do it, it's wrong. And that's that. It's all black and white. Whereas in Buddhism, it's a matter of your own mental states. And even if you believe that I am doing this, let's say I'm giving alms to a beggar. So I'm getting merit for that. That's a meritorious deed. I'm giving alms to a beggar, but I'm thinking, I'm giving alms to a beggar. And just this self-view, this delusion, of like identity view, that's going to cause a certain amount of demerit or unskillful karma. So anything with any greed, hate, or delusion, or attraction, aversion, or semi-conscious stupidity, any act that has any of that is going to have a certain demerit to it, which is pretty much everything that an unenlightened person does. But still, you can get merit also. And so you got the person loaded on crack in a dumpster chanting mantras. He might be getting some merit for the chanting mantras, and he might be getting some merit for other things too. Maybe he's being mindful. Maybe he just adjusts his position in the dumpster mindfully, gets like this little merit point, so to speak, for this moment of lucidity, of mindfulness. So, who knows? He's on crack. That's like cocaine. I've never done crack before, but I assume it's a form of cocaine. It might cause a certain lucidity of mind. You might have certain insights, which you might get merit for that too. But as a general rule, if you're like addicted to something and you're living a kind of lifestyle of a homeless druggie, then there's probably going to be at least as much demerit as merit, regardless of how wisely you try to be a crack addict getting loaded in dumpsters. So I think I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's next question here. He says it's his second question because I think he forgot about the painful, grotesque thing question, which he asked on a different in a different location. So anyways, he says, my question here is in whether or not it is safe to mostly discard or discount something like Tantra. I feel that it's even more out of range than something like Pure Land Buddhism or the strong devotional crypto-theism of Mahayana. Really, in what way is extreme sensual activity useful in cultivating wisdom? Inducing trauma like that seems to just be dangerous or even flat out disgusting. It seemingly appeals to those that want to be esoteric or enigmatic but want to evade the effort, resulting in a kind of lazy lay existence with a dharmic excuse to take drugs and engage in unsayable, atrocious activities under the guise of spiritual development. I think that it's funny to imagine that some in ancient times took heroic doses of cannabis and datura and lay down in snow or ice for hours and just had some kind of miraculous click. But I find that something like this appeals to the absolute minority. Okay, so I'm just now realizing that there's 4 questions here because Thermal Squid did not recall having asked his first question elsewhere. So this is problematic and transgressive and everything, but I don't know. I suppose I should just answer this question before I deal with the issue of a 4th transgressive question. Let's see. Oh, with regard to Tantra. Well, what most people in the West are calling Tantra isn't really Tantra. So that's for starters. Most people who think they're doing Tantra, they're just wallowing in sensuality and calling it Tantra. But Tantra is a philosophy based on the idea that we are now in the Kali Yuga, and saintliness is not a realistic option. Especially like in the West, it's even less of an option in the West, just because saintliness it's very much out of fashion. Even like normal virtue and self-restraint is out of fashion as a general rule in the West. So, especially among young people. So what Tantra was doing, it was indulging in like limited amounts of stereotypical immorality as a way of learning how to cultivate wise mental states and make spiritual progress while living in a kind of degenerate age. And it was based, at least what I was taught, based on the 5 M's. M, you got maituna, which is sex, mamsa, which is meat. Let's see, how do you say fish? Matcha, it's fish, I'm pretty sure. Majja is alcohol. And the 5th one, it's sort of like certain words in the Rig Veda or even in Shakespeare where they don't entirely know exactly what it is anymore. And so it's probably some kind of drug that started with an M, but it has been replaced with parched grain. And I don't think that parched grain is particularly like conducive to immorality, but that's what they do in these rituals. And so, I mean, they might just take a sip of the alcohol. They're not going to get wasted on it. With regard to the meat and the fish, they might just take a little taste of it just for the sake of having done that, this transgressive act while living in this transgressive age. And with regard to sex, I have read that the way you have tantric sex is the man will lie on his back motionless, and a certain woman, a dakini, I think she's called, will, essentially do cowgirl position on him. And she has been trained at like some temple to be able to have sex without being emotionally involved. I think there are a lot of women who just do this naturally, but she's just kind of going through this almost like a meditative exercise, and he's supposed to just be meditative. He's technically literally having sex. His penis is inserted into a vagina, but at the same time, he's just trying to be mindful of the sensations that arise and not being carried away by lust while doing it. And that's really the whole point of Tantra. It's not like you're wallowing in it. It's you're learning how to engage in these stereotypically degenerate acts while living in this degenerate Kali Yuga, while at the same time not getting sucked into it, remaining detached and being mindful of it. So that, the mindfulness is pretty much the main tool with regard to being detached from it. Instead of, just getting into it, you're just experiencing the sensations objectively. And most people who try it, especially if they're like amateurs who have read about it in a book or something, they just don't do it right. And they're just wallowing in sensuality and thinking that they're doing Tantra, maybe telling others that they're doing Tantra, when really, there might be a little bit of Tantra involved, but mainly they are deceiving themselves. And I do think that there is a certain, to some degree, everybody has to do Tantra, like even a monk. Like there are certain sensual pleasures that a monk can't avoid, like eating food or sleeping or bathing. And so he just has to do that with detachment. You eat food just to keep yourself healthy. You're not doing it in order to wallow in sensuality. And so Tantra is like taking it a step further with regard to sensual pleasures that you could technically avoid, but just don't. And it's pretty much the same kind of procedure as a monk eating good food or taking a bath or something that is pretty much unavoidable. And so he just remains detached while doing it. So it's not necessarily like you're just wallowing in stuff that's flat out disgusting. That might be what people who are calling it Tantra in the West are doing, like a lot of New Age people maybe, but like traditional Tantra, there might be some disgusting imagery, but it's, as a general rule, it's really not that wild. It's just sort of limited amounts of stereotypical immoral behaviors that you learn to do mindfully. So, let's see, thermal squids. Third question, which is really his 4th question. Oh, okay. This one I'll just answer very briefly because it's a transgressive 4th question anyway. So what are some of your favorite words and most hated words? I'll just give like 2 main examples. One example of possibly my favorite word in the English language, which is supposedly. I really like the word supposedly. for some reason. I mean, it just describes samsara. I mean, that's the word for samsara. It's the adverb for samsara anyway, supposedly. And the one word that comes to mind in the English language that I particularly dislike is normalcy. A return to normalcy. It's not normalcy, it's normality. Normality. So that one kind of triggers me a little bit when I hear normalcy. I mean, I just kind of cringe inwardly just saying it just seconds ago. Other words that I like the word regmaglipt. It just rolls off the tongue, regmaglipt. And it's a word describing the little dimples on the surface of a meteorite. Like, it looks sort of like the dimples on a golf ball. Those little dimples on a meteorite are called regmaglits, which is really nice. Also, I learned another really nice word just recently, just a few weeks ago, petrichor. And petrichor, which literally means something like stone blood, is the word for describing that heavenly smell after the first rain, after a protracted period of hot weather. So a lot of you probably know what I'm talking about. I never smelled it in the Pacific Northwest because there was never a protracted period of hot weather before without rain. But in Burma, living in like the semi-desert wastelands of central Burma, the first rain of the hot season, or after, like towards the end of the hot season, there's this smell in the air it's sort of like baking bricks with like a hint of baking bread. And that smell is called petrichor, which is nice. I mean, it's nice that it has its own word. I mean, in the English language, there are certain just common phenomena in this world that English has no word for it. Like the need to take a pee. Like if you need to eat something, you're hungry. You might even be ravenous. If you need to drink something, you're thirsty. If you need to sleep, you're sleepy or exhausted or tired. But you need to take a pee, there's no word for it. And I mean, sometimes you got to pee really bad. You don't have time for all these extra syllables. There should be a word just for that, and there isn't. But then again, it's like I've mentioned before, maybe not on Q&As, that in the Burmese language, there's owls all over the country. They don't have a word for owl. There's owls in downtown Rangoon. They don't have a word for owl. It's like each kind of owl has its own name, but there's no collective generic word for owl. Same for lizards. They got a word for snake. They do not have a word just for lizard. Each kind of lizard has its own name. There's lizards in downtown Rangoon. Lizards everywhere. They don't have a word for lizard. They do have a word for snake, though. So I guess I shouldn't pick on the English language too much. Anyways, Thermal Squid just volunteers that some of his favorite English words are critter, warbling, lucidity, and evoke. And some of his least favorite words are seepage, oblong, slurping, gurgling, and cudgeling. So apparently he's more interested in just the sounds, like the melodious or anti-melodious sounds of a word, whereas for me, I think regmaglipt is, I just love the way it just rolls off the tongue, but supposedly is more of a philosophical liking, I think. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Quesitor. And Quesitor says, it seems that the state of jhana is achievable by removing sankharas, like mopping the floor to reveal clean tiles. Arhats cannot create new sankharas to dirty the floor again. How then are arhats not constantly in fourth jhana? Also, if they have sankharas remaining, wouldn't their constant equanimity obliterate the remaining ones? So I think by sankharas, he's using more of a Mahayanist term. I think in like Pali Buddhism, it'd be more like kilesas, your defilements. You have to remove or at least suppress your defilements in order to attain jhana. And jhana, especially second, third, and fourth jhana, you're not thinking anymore. But thinking isn't necessarily a defilement. So, I mean, after you attain jhana, you come out of jhana. And from the traditional orthodox point of view, jhana, you can't really be moving around talking when you're in jhana, because your mind is becoming like clear. And in order to move around and talk and, navigate through samsara and communicate with others and so forth, then you've got to be back into thinking mode. So technically, according to Orthodox Theravada, I'm pretty sure you can't be in fourth jhana when you're walking around talking. And it's not like permanently removing, you have to remove your defilements, your kilesas, but that doesn't mean that you're just, by doing that, you're automatically in jhana. That's just sort of a prerequisite. As attending college, you have a prerequisite of a high school diploma or what is it? GED in America. But that doesn't mean that you're in college just because you've got a high school diploma. That's just like a prerequisite. So there are other factors involved in attaining jhana. Mainly, you sit still, you sort of avoid stimulations, which will be stimulating your mind and keeping you from being in jhana. You go to a quiet, secluded place, sit down, meditate, and then you can attain jhana. But then there are times when you got to interact with other people and so forth, in which jhana just is not an option. So in a sense, if you're enlightened, you don't need jhana anymore. See, jhana, it's especially fourth jhana, you've got like I was already saying, your mind is clear like glass, or you've got a flat calm. Your mind, if, going with the analogy of water, you have turned your mind into a flat calm. In order to go beyond the distractions of the waves, where you can just see the water as water and not just be stuck at the level of waves. But then if you're enlightened, when the waves come back, you can still stay at the level of water. That's in Zen, it's called Zen in the marketplace. That Zen in the marketplace is 10,000 times better than Zen on the cushion. Because Zen on the cushion, before you're enlightened, you have to get to this flat calm in order to get this transcendence of all the symbols of samsara. But once you're enlightened, you don't need that anymore. That's like a gimmick. It's like training wheels, kind of. You don't need that, because even when there's a raging stormy sea, you can still be seeing water as water. Whereas if an unenlightened normie in the stormy sea, they're just like, whoa, all these huge waves, all this crashing and roaring, they don't see just water anymore. So, yeah, it's like fourth jhana is called temporary liberation, or just jhana in general. In Pali Buddhism, in Theravada Buddhism, is called temporary liberation, but it's not permanent. But once you get to the permanent liberation, you don't really need jhana anymore. Jhana is just sort of a way of seeing the water as water and not getting lost in all the waves, because jhana is like reducing the waves to a bare minimum so that you don't have those waves to get distracted by. But once you have mastered seeing the water as water, then when the waves come back, it doesn't even matter. They are irrelevant. So, I'll move on to Quesator's second question. In the process of eradicating sankharas and moving to subtler and subtler realities, are we removing the karmic effects that attachment to those sankharas or wrong views could result in? Are we removing the karmic effects that attachment to those sankharas could result in? If this is the case, would an arhat be completely free from kama? Could Moggallana's death simply be a result of the kama of the people who killed him? Perhaps Moggallana had the kama of the momentum of the path, whilst he was at a lower stage of enlightenment, and perhaps that kama was protecting him. Once he becomes an arhat, that protection is no longer needed. Going with orthodox Theravada, that once you become enlightened, you stop making new kama, but you still got this past kama that is still going to be working itself out up until you die. You attain Nibbana, and then that residual vestigial past karma just poofs out of existence. I think that to some degree that may be a kind of, I don't know, I'm tempted to call it an oversimplification based on the drive of early Buddhist philosophers to fit the whole philosophy so that it is of a piece. And they wound up with just one level, where nirvana is at the same level of reality as tongue sensitivity or femininity, things like that, earth element. So they really did not have a multi-level understanding of reality. It was like a two-dimensional flat plane when really they might have been better off thinking more three-dimensionally. So I think I might need to read this question again. And I do notice there are at least 2 question marks here, 3 question marks in one question. So let's see here. In the process of eradicating sankharas, again, you don't really eradicate sankharas, at least not all of them, according to Orthodox Theravada, because any conditioned thing is a sankhara, or also any, I guess by sankharas here, he might be referring to like volitional acts, because sankhara can also mean volitional act, like sankhara kanda mainly means cetana or volition or will. So we're moving to subtler and subtler realities. Are we removing the karmic effects that attachment to those volitional acts could result in? I don't fully understand this question. Are we, in the process of eradicating sankharas, are we removing the karmic effects that attachment to those sankharas would result in? To some degree, I suppose, although, I mean, in a way, you're not so much removing as transcending. You can't totally remove all volitional acts. According to Orthodox Theravada, like in Abhidhamma, they have to come up with some new kind of mind called Kiriya Chitta, which accounts for how an enlightened being apparently does volitional acts still. But it's not mentioned at all in the text, and it was apparently just a way of like shoring up one of their theories with regard to how the mind works. And it's not very convincing. So probably, I mean, in my opinion, that an enlightened being still has the semblance of volitional acts, but he has transcended that. He's not working at that level of reality anymore. That's just nature taking its course. That's waves when he is now focused on water. So whether it's a flat calm or a raging stormy sea, it's still the same exact water. And that's kind of the way the enlightened mind operates. And someone like Meister Eckhart might call the water God. It's all God. So let's see. In this case, would an arhat be completely free from kama? He's transcended it. I still think, like, even in Orthodox Theravada, there's still residual past kama, even if he's not making any new kama. But from my point of view, he has just transcended it. He no longer has attachment to it one way or the other. So could Moggallana's death simply be a result of the kama of the people who killed him? Not just the kama of the people who killed him, but everyone who is affected by Moggallana's death. Yeah, that's a possibility. That's one way of looking at it, at least. But still, I mean, there's this residual kama that Moggallana still has, even though, like, subjectively he has transcended that. It's still just nature taking its course. It's still water seeking its own balance, so to speak. So perhaps Moggallana had the kama of the momentum of the path whilst he was at a lower stage of enlightenment, and perhaps that kama was protecting him. I do think that it's just a matter of water and waves, or just transcending karma rather than eradicating it. You don't necessarily eradicate your karma. You just transcend it. It's still kind of there. It's just irrelevant from your own, like, where your center is. You know, it's just water. It's not this wave versus that wave anymore. It's just water, and it's just kind of irrelevant. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. Romeo says, what is your elevator pitch for the evidence of the existence of karma to someone doubtful of it? Well, I would start off with just the automatic pilot aspect of karma. Karma is like habitual energy. It's like habit energy that drives us through life while we are sleepwalking in a kind of semi-conscious stupor that, I mean, it's like karma is mostly running the show. It's just like habitual responses to accustomed stimuli. So it's like automatic pilot. That would be an obvious example of karma that even a scientific, materialistic normie could accept. That would be like a foot in the door. And then you'd have to, I mean, depending on how open-minded they are with regard to metaphysics and so forth, once you get that idea that we are pretty much running on automatic pilot most of the time, that most people are running on automatic pilot most of the time, they're not fully awake. It's just practically like knee-jerk reactions. That then you can get into the metaphysics of it, where we're doing that even at deeper levels. That we're just creating our own reality through force of habit. But a materialist probably won't take it that far. But at the very least, you can get the foot in the door with regard to just the force of habit is like a manifestation of the Buddhist idea of karma. It is the momentum of your mental states. So, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, karma is volition. Karma is cetana. So, in order to deny karma, you'd have to deny volition or will, which most people wouldn't do. Even most scientists wouldn't. So, I mean, you can get a foot in the door pretty easily, but then, I mean, if they're just hardcore materialist, scientific realist or whatever, that might be as far as you're going to get, because, I mean, in order to believe in karma in the more like metaphysical kind of, the more like fully Buddhist perspective of it, then, I mean, you're going to have to leave behind strict mechanistic materialism or something along those lines, and accept that this universe is to a profound degree a manifestation of mind. Even some theoretical physics agrees with this, that it's the mind that collapses the state vector, so to speak. So it's the habits of mind are collapsing the state vector in like established ways, habitual ways that are creating our reality, something along those lines. You might be able to sort of make some headway even with some scientific realist if you adopt that kind of approach, maybe. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's next question, which is also that, are there any beginner's books you can recommend for someone trying to better understand and wrap their heads around karma? And to tell you the truth, no, I can't think of any book for a beginner that you can recommend for someone trying to better understand and wrap their heads around karma. I mean, maybe Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now. Maybe. Yeah, I really can't think of any. I mean, I can't remember ever reading a book like, the Beginner's Guide to Karma. Everything you ever want to know about karma, but we're afraid to ask. The Karma Primer. I can't recall ever coming across something like that. So you'd have to come across maybe some kind of self-help book on how to overcome just these pre-programmed habits, how to break habitual habit patterns. That might be your best approach to like a beginner's guide to karma, because like I said in answer to the previous question, sort of like the surface level, the most indisputable form of karma is just this automatic pilot of just habits driving us through life. So it could be, if you find some kind of self-help book maybe written by some clinical psychologist or something, on how to understand your habit patterns and how to undo your bad habits. Some kind of book like that would probably be a good one, even though it might not contain the word karma at all. But if you're trying to understand karma from an orthodox Buddhist point of view, I don't think you're really gonna, you'll get like a good intellectual grasp of what the official traditional doctrine is. But I don't think it would be nearly as helpful in understanding the reality of karma as this self-help book that teaches you how to recognize and overcome like habitual behavior patterns. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Skoladin or Skuladin. And Skoladin or Skuladin says, what do you think about the Warrens, Ed and Lorraine? And what do I think about them? I saw a documentary about them a few months ago, and I've just seen like little, I've seen a few ghost shows that had Lorraine Warren. I almost called her Lorraine Newman. Those of you who are old enough to remember the first cast of Saturday Night Live would know who Lorraine Newman is. But Ed and Lorraine Warren, I really don't recall a whole lot from that documentary. That Lorraine was more or less of a psychic. Ed was more of less psychically talented, but was really into the investigative aspect. And so they kind of teamed up. It might be what brought them together in the first place, their shared passion for understanding paranormal activity or some such. Or it may be that just it happened after they got together. I can't remember now. But I do think that for the most part, they were sincere. They may have sensationalized certain things for the sake of, their careers. But my sweetie and I, she's kind of got me pretty much I wouldn't say hooked on it, but I'm very willing to go along with this tradition she has had for many years of before going to bed at night, watching a ghost show. And, like The Dead Files or Paranormal Lockdown or, let's see, Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures. Portals to Hell was one of my favorites with Katrina Weidman and Jack Osborne, who is Ozzy Osbourne's son. That they go to these haunted houses or haunted theaters or haunted condemned prisons or whatever. And I assume they're pretty much like the modern iteration of Ed and Lorraine Warren. I don't think that Ed and Lorraine had something that subsequent ghost hunters don't have. And there's lots of shows you can watch. There was one, Ghost Adventures. I think they're the most popular, and I really don't. I refuse to watch that one because the hosts of the show are just so cringe that they're supposedly paranormal investigators, but they're just sensationalistic as fuck, just trying to be entertaining and make a good show. And, it's like, oh, I just got a weird feeling. They're just walking around. Ooh, it felt like something just touched my arm. It's like that's half the show. And a lot of them, they won't use real psychics, or at least people who claim to be psychics. They're trying to use like technological devices. So they've got like these little things that look like radios that produce this static, and every once in a while you'll hear something that sounds like a human voice, which invariably they will interpret as spirits trying to communicate by manipulating the static in this device. And sometimes it's like they hear something like and it's like, it just said go away or I'm going to kill you. So this kind of stuff is ridiculous. I don't know to what extent Ed and Lorraine Warren engaged in that. I think they were sort of pre-technological stuff. They hadn't invented like ghost boxes or anything yet. And so they were mainly relying on Lorraine, her alleged psychic abilities, to just kind of feel into it. And the ghost shows that my sweetheart and I watch, my beloved woman, Yeah, I prefer the ones with psychics over the ones that are relying on like technological gadgets to detect changes in. I mean, if you can, it's fine to have gadgets that are like infrared sensors, like, because like if there is like spirit activity, like a common event is it causes a coldness in the air. Also, it drains batteries. It's like if there is going to be any kind of manifestation, that they have to absorb energy through heat or through energy like stored in a battery or something in order to produce the manifestation. So that's kind of interesting, I guess. But I'm just kind of digressing all over the place. I do think the Warrens were sincere. I do think that they weren't entirely frauds. There might be a little bit of trickster element. Like, I read a book. It's one of the most important books I read, especially over the past 20 years, The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen, where he's talking about how even talented psychics or talented, people with like paranormal abilities, they'll still indulge in a certain amount of trickery and fakery, which is like transgressive and like helps to open cracks in the rules that are governing this version of reality so that genuine paranormal activity can come through. They tend to be liminal beings, and they try to make things more liminal, and like fakery, a certain amount of fraud, ironically, can actually like help produce more genuine paranormal activity, which is this weird, almost like a catch-23 situation. So, I mean, getting back to the Warrens, I really don't know nearly as much about the Warrens as I know about somebody like Katrina Weidman, who is like a modern, or like Amy Allen from the Dead Files. But I mean, some of these shows, I do think there is a lot of fakery in this ghost hunting stuff. Like, and not just fakery, but also just like jumping to conclusions. Like the common theme of the Dead Files. You got Amy Allen and Steve DeChevy, who was he's like a retired New York homicide cop. They're teamed up to investigate haunted houses. And Amy Allen is the psychic. And Steve DeChevy, he just does the investigating part. He's like, he's asking questions, sort of like interviewing the people who live in the house, seeing what's going on there. And it's like somebody says, I got scratched in the middle of the night, and I just happen to have the picture of it right here. And they'll show this picture of a scratch on their skin. Like anyone who gets scratched in the night carries around pictures of it. And then he'll be investigating like librarians, he'll go interview a librarian or local historian or something. And it turns out that only 40 years ago, somebody was brutally murdered only half a mile from here. And then they just kind of fit that narrative into the haunted house, which strikes me as questionable. But it does seem like there is a certain amount of genuine paranormal activity in haunted houses. I mean, even on these shows, sometimes you'll see weird stuff or hear weird sounds, that kind of thing. So, I mean, one of the most remarkable, I mean, it could have been faked, but there was like, it was an episode of Portals to Hell with Katrina Weidman and Ozzy Osbourne's son. And they have cameras everywhere through this, I think it was a haunted hotel. And there was like a ballroom with chairs. And one of the chairs just all of a sudden, just sitting there, just twists like, 45 degrees. And why a ghost would want to just twist a chair just for fun, I don't know. But still, it's stuff like that. It's my father, he claimed to see ghosts. I've seen, like, supposedly when I was like 3 or 4 years old, I could see a ghost of the lady that used to live in the house before we lived there. I'm open-minded with regard to the possibility of paranormal phenomena. I'm certainly no materialist. And so I'm answering this question in a very prolonged, digressive kind of way, but I do think that there is something to it. I think that some people, like the Ghost Adventures guys, they're mainly just entertainers. They just want to make a good show, and they're very successful. They've got like half a dozen spin-offs at least, but they're just cringe. I just refuse to watch them. I've seen a few episodes, and that was plenty. So, yeah, I mean, the world is not just mechanistic, materialistic phenomena. That there is weird stuff that science cannot explain, and it probably will never explain it, other than just fitting it into a category like quantum randomness, which is also something they can't explain. That, they just, they'll account for it. They'll say, yeah, that's quantum randomness. And so at least they acknowledge it. And it may be that more and more paranormal stuff will eventually get at least acknowledged, even if it isn't explained by modern science or postmodern science. But the Warrens were, in a way, they were like the forerunners of this exploding population of ghost hunters that have their own TV shows nowadays. So I'm just going to move on to Skuladin or Skuladine's next question, which is a follow-up on the previous one, which is, what's your expert opinion on the museum that the Warrens started that's filled with cursed objects? And his characteristic bullet point comment here is, I think the Warrens are gone now, so I'm not sure what happens to the inventory of items that were said to involve demons, ghosts, and sleep paralysis entities. And then in parentheses, he's got worst case scenario. So, what's my expert opinion on the museum that the Warrens started that's filled with cursed objects? I don't know much about the museum, although one of the episodes of Portals to Hell with Katrina Weidman and Ozzy Osbourne's son, they went to one of these museums that had lots of weird kind of black magic-y cursed stuff. And they did have one of those voice boxes, or at least a previous investigator had recorded a voice coming through there. One of the most haunted objects they had at this museum was this grotesque clown doll that was locked in a cage, and it was made by prisoners at a concentration camp in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, allegedly. And it was just, they had a chain around the cage to make sure it stays closed. And they were playing, this radio thing, these previous investigators. And it just sounded like a kid's voice very clearly saying, I'm stuck in this box. Static before, static after. And then just very clearly this kid's voice saying, I'm stuck in this box, which could have been a total fraud. It could have been fake. But there was weird stuff. I mean, weird stuff happens. I mean, I've lived in a house with a poltergeist before. I've explained that several times. So, I mean, I'm open-minded with regard to this. I think the world is a manifestation of mind, and there's going to be certain events that just do not follow rules. That weird stuff can happen that's just not supposed to happen. That laws of physics, so-called, can be broken. And with regard to these cursed objects, I think it's possible that I remember, it causes me to remember when I was in my 20s, like my mid-20s, before I became a monk, I was in a bookstore, and I saw a book for sale written by Aleister Crowley. And I was tempted to buy that book. I was curious what the philosophy of Aleister Crowley would be like. And then I thought, well, it could be that he just put a curse. I mean, he was a bad man. He may have, just for shits and giggles, put a curse on that book to curse anyone who read it or even who touched it. So it kind of scared me off. I didn't do it. I can be a little superstitious in that regard. But yeah, I mean, what's going to happen to the Warrens Museum? I assume it's going to keep going. I don't think they're just going to auction off everything. Here, you can buy this cursed Ouija board that was used in a black mass or something. for, opening bid $50. I mean, somebody might do that, but I don't think it'd be very wise. So, yeah, I guess the inventory of items that are in the museum, I assume somebody else is just going to continue running the museum and continue earning the profits for the $5 admission fee or whatever they charge. So, but I do think that, you can have cursed objects or, hexed objects or even like blessed objects even. But it depends a lot on the minds of the people who are like operating with regard to these objects, because it's all a manifestation of mind anyway. So I don't think that just inanimate objects will necessarily have any kind of juju, but any consciousness associated with those objects can, in a way, attribute that juju, and faith of a grain of mustard seed can move mountains. So somebody believes, even if it's just like some kind of spirit being believes that object has got juju in it, it can cause it to have some kind of effect. And I've just been rambling on that one. That was a half-hour long answer. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, if Abhidhamma scholars don't believe in a subconscious mind or storehouse consciousness, where would they say things like facts, opinions, and memories reside within the mind? It's not so much that they are residing, there's just a potential for them to arise. I asked a Burmese Abhidhamma scholar once, sort of about this, and he says, in Abhidhamma, they refer to a certain ahon, and ahon is a Burmese word which means momentum. So it's like karma is the momentum of your mental states, and so there's like a residual potential of things to arise due to this momentum that's going. I didn't ask him the question specifically about the subconscious mind, because in Abhidhamma there really is no subconscious mind other than what is called bhavanga citta, which is like a holding pattern. It's like your last conscious like mental image in your previous existence. Somehow, according to Abhidhamma philosophy, or at least Abhidhamma commentaries, it becomes like the whole like the screen on the TV sets back in the old days. There was like the Indian and like the circle. It looked like a target kind of, that, it would just be there when the station was off the air. That's kind of the way bhavanga citta operates. It's just this image in your mind that doesn't change. It's flickering off and on a trillion times a second, but still, it's just there when your mind isn't otherwise occupied with something else, which is a pretty lame idea for a subconscious mind. Otherwise, they've also got what is, in Theravada Buddhism, you've got what is called anusaya, which is a latent tendency, an underlying tendency, which doesn't mean that it's lying in wait, that it exists. It's just that there is a potential for that. When the conditions conducive to that arising are right, then it arises. So, yeah, it's not like memories or facts or opinions are always just lurking under the surface from a Buddhist point of view. It's just that there is the potential for them to arise because your mind follows these habitual karmic patterns, which then will come to a configuration of suitable conditions that will cause that to arise. So you have to eliminate the conditions that cause it to arise in order for it not to arise anymore. So it's not like you've got these memories that are just stored and they're just there all the time, but at like a subconscious level. It's just that there is the potential for that memory to arise when the circumstances are right for it. So I hope that was at least somewhat explanatory, because I'm moving on to Xenothoid's next question, which is as follows. What do you think of the idea of cultural appropriation? I used to think it was a completely bullshit concept until I realized that, very ironically, the worst example in the world of cultural appropriation is white liberals thinking that Asian religions, Buddhism in particular, are completely compatible with cultural Marxism and practically synonymous with leftist activism. Just goes to show how unaware and conceited they really are. Well, the problem with the white liberals thinking that Asian religions, Buddhism in particular, are completely compatible with cultural Marxism is that they're not taking the cultural appropriation far enough. They're just appropriating certain aspects of Buddhism that they like and just ignoring or rejecting the rest of it. So they'd be much better off if they were more thorough in their cultural appropriation. But cultural appropriation, to make a crime or some sort of microaggression out of it, is just idiotic. I mean, it's just stupid. You've got, several years ago, this is maybe back around 2016, there was some white guy with dreadlocks who was being hounded by these two black people with like, they were like threatening to cut his dreadlocks off because he was appropriating their culture. Well, at the very same time, they're speaking English and dressed in Western clothing. These two black people that are hounding the white guy for having dreadlocks. Which is, I mean, it's just idiotic. It's like one reason why the ancient Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, and then the Empire became so great was because they adopted the idea of cultural appropriation. Anything that works, especially like militarily, anything that works, like some enemies in Spain had a sword that worked really well. The Romans started using that sword, the gladius, which is where the word gladiator comes from. It means swordsman. So it's like cultural appropriation is really a good idea. If you've got some other country that comes up with some innovation that really is a good idea, you're stupid. I mean, it's almost suicidal not to adopt it. And what's wrong with Americans eating pizza? I mean, it's cultural appropriation of Italian culture. We actually improved on pizza. Pizza was considered to be poor man's food. It was mostly just like plain cheese pizza at first when it was in Italy. And then it comes to America and Americans start putting all kinds of meat and mushrooms and onions and stuff on it. And then it goes back to Italy in this improved, they culturally appropriated the new kind of pizza from us. So I don't see any problem at all with cultural appropriation. It's just common sense. It's just that with regard to the American liberals adopting Buddhism, they just adopt only certain parts of it. So their cultural appropriation is incomplete and inadequate. If they appropriated more of it, it would be better. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's third question, which is, how does charity function within Buddhist culture? And what is its relationship to Buddhism's intention-based ethics? So charity, I assume he's referring to dana, which literally means giving. And it's not technically considered to be the same as morality. Morality in Buddhism is negative. Morality is don't do this and don't do that and don't do the other, whereas giving is do that. It's a positive act, which is not a matter of sila, strangely. From the traditional Buddhist point of view, dana and sila are two different things. So how does it function within Buddhist culture? Well, I can speak mainly from the point of view of Burmese Buddhist culture, in which case it's largely a kind of spiritual materialism, where people think that they're earning merit points, which will help them to get into heaven or help them get reborn as rich and beautiful in their next life by offering stuff to monks. And really, in Burma, most donations go to monks. It's just this idea they want the most profit from their investment, which is, this spiritual materialism. They're going to donate something. They want as much back from that as they can possibly get. And so donating to the Sangha, that's the best thing you can donate to. Monks have been hammering away at this for 2,500 years, almost, probably. So, you've got wise guy monks that are just continually pounding away at, if you offer stuff to monks, you get just tremendous benefits. You're gonna just be set up for lifetime after lifetime after that, for offering a new meditation cabin to this monastery or whatever. And so in Burma, people, one time I tried to explain to a village doctor, you're better off feeding a hungry village kid or even a hungry village dog than to put another dish of food in front of an obese monk who's already got 50 dishes of food sitting in front of him. And he just didn't see it that way at all. It's like, but you get more merit by offering to monks. Meanwhile, the little kid and the village dog are hungry. So the Burmese especially, I really can't speak for all Asian Buddhists, of course, but there is a lot of spiritual materialism in Burmese Buddhism. And with regard to how charity, how it causes merit, it's a way of breaking your selfishness, breaking your self-view, that, you want to cling to what is yours, and it helps you to break these bonds of selfishness mainly. That would be the main spiritual benefit. Plus, of course, you're setting yourself up for, in the future, people will give more stuff to you. And you'd be better off, still, in my opinion, feeding a hungry village kid or even a hungry village dog than to give food to an obese monk who's already got 50 dishes of food in front of him. Because it may be that when you're hungry, then somebody will feed you. Or if you're like the Burmese person, you're hungry and they walk right past you with a bag of food in order to give it to some obese monk who's already got way too much food. So, yeah, some things like building a pagoda, that's just considered to be a stairway to heaven. You're practically guaranteed of heaven in Burma if you sponsor the building of a pagoda. They don't really like fixing old pagodas, but building a brand new one, that's the stairway to heaven right there. So the Burmese see it more as a kind of spiritual investment, just like spiritual materialism, whereas I would view it somewhat differently. You really should not be goal-oriented in your charity or your morality. It should be its own reward. I think that's one of the last sentences in Spinoza's Ethics, is that virtue is its own reward. You shouldn't be doing virtuous acts in order to get some benefit later on, like you want to get into heaven or something. It is kind of sullies the virtue of it. It's just a transaction. It's like you're trying to bribe God or something. So just do it because it's just the right thing to do. And don't worry about the benefits you're going to get from it. And then, ironically, you get more benefit from it that way. I remember one time, one of my teachers in Burma gave this sermon on how the best way to get the maximum benefit from what you do, like a meritorious deed, like charity or something, is do it without any hope or expectation of rewards. And so the people, a lot of them, they're thinking, I want the most rewards possible, so I'm going to have to donate this. In order to get the most rewards possible, I'm going to have to donate this in such a way that I'm not expecting rewards. And it's just like fucking their own minds up, trying to squeeze as much merit out of their meritorious deeds as they can. It's kind of sad, really. But, they're very virtuous people. They're astonishingly virtuous by Western standards, and it's partly due to spiritual materialism, partly just due to like cultural conformity. They're just conforming to their social norms, but still, it's good regardless, even though it might not have the most exalted reasons for it. Still, it's a good thing. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovak and Sipat Zidana. And Siovak and Sipat Zidana says, do you think the English world has colonized the West? And he included with this a video link to some German bigwig speaking to Vladimir Putin in English. He says that he's German, but he's addressing Putin in English. And Putin asks him, why are you speaking English? You're a German. Why aren't you speaking German? And so Siovaktion Sipat Zina says, because of this, maybe, or at least partly because of this, do I think that the English world has colonized the West? To some degree, maybe. I don't think it's really being colonized, though. It's like throughout history in the West, there's always been like a lingua franca, which nowadays is English. English is like the one language you can speak throughout much of the world, and people will know what you're saying. Before it was English, it was French. Like back in the 1700s, that French was the lingua franca, where, you could find and wherever you were in the world, you'd probably, unless you're like someplace really remote, that you'd find someone who also spoke French. Before that, it was probably Latin. Latin was the lingua franca for centuries. So it just makes sense that you're going to have one language that is like the main language that people from different cultures that can, they can all speak that language. So an educated person, like the overwhelming majority of Dutch people speak fluent English. That I saw like a map or an infographic or something talking about just the percentage of population of each different countries that speak English. And it was well above 90% in the Netherlands. And other countries also, it's very high. So it's not so much colonization, it's just a matter of that's just like the universal language, or as close to a universal language as we've got nowadays, unless maybe you're in the Far East and it might be like Mandarin Chinese. So, to some degree, the English world has kind of not exactly colonized the West, but in a way sort of conquered it with regard to like technological innovations of the Anglosphere have then permeated the rest of the world. Most of the technological innovations in the world were invented in the Anglosphere, although like the Germans also have invented some things, and like the Italians and the French and so forth. But mostly, overwhelmingly, it has been, the British and the Americans, especially with regard to technology. So I don't know if I'd call that colonization, though. Colonization has a different meaning to it. We've heavily influenced the rest of the world, but I think that's different from actual colonization. So I'm just going to move on to Siovaktion Sipat Zirna's next question. And I have to say that Siovaktion Sipat Zirna, he's been getting into these abstruse technical questions with regard to Buddhist philosophy, which I'm not confident that I'm the most qualified person to answer with regard to like technicalities in the philosophy. I've always just been more practically minded, sort of pragmatic, empirical. And a lot of the stuff that you find in the text, these technicalities, have never really been of great interest to me. But I think I might be jumping the gun a little bit because I'm not even sure exactly. I don't remember precisely what he's asking here. So he says, in the suttas, it tells of a way to attain enlightenment by seeing the five aggregates as impermanent. Over the years, teachers like Mahasi Sayadaw have come up with their own methods to try to do that. And then in parentheses, he's got by noting them. And then he says, but how do you think this was practically done in the past? Well, I think probably, what Mahasi Sayadaw was advising, just being mindful of everything as it arises and passes away, that's one of the best ways of getting insight into arising and passing away. So I don't think Mahasi Sayadaw invented anything new. One of the Vipassana insight knowledges that anyone is supposed to experience, according to Orthodox Theravada, is the insight knowledge of arising and passing away of phenomena. Also, when somebody becomes an Arya, the traditional formula for describing them as having become an Arya is they realize everything that has a beginning has an end. It is just the nature of anything with a beginning to pass away. And if you're like carefully observing phenomena in your meditative practice, then you see everything is arising and passing away. Everything's like in a state of flux. Even something that seems like it's pretty stable really isn't. You've got a pain in your knee. You might think that it's the same pain from one moment to the next, but if you are sitting there doing mindfulness and meditation and your knee is in pain, you can just feel it just sort of throbbing and surging, and just, it's like in this constant state of change. And so certainly it's going to be mindfulness, just mindful attention is going to allow people to realize that really everything is in a state of flux, that even stuff that seems like it's pretty stable is really just constantly changing. Everything's just arising and passing away. Your own mental states, your own mind, you just close your eyes, so that you'd think that everything is black. You would assume most people would just say, when you close your eyes, what do you see? They just see, you don't see anything. It's just black. But I mean, if you're mindful and you're just very attentively looking at what you can see with your eyes closed, it's just like this flickering static. It's very dark. You could say that it's black, but still it's very discernible, perceivable, like flickering static going on the whole time. And it's the same thing when your eyes are open. It's just that it's not as obvious because you've got too many other things to distract you. Hearing is the same way, always changing. Just the feelings in your body always changing. And if you're being mindful of that, it becomes more and more obvious. So, I'm going to move on to Seal of Action and Sipad Zidina's third question, which is as follows. It says in the suttas that when form and eye make contact, eye consciousness arises. However, we can also see in dreams despite our eyes being closed. Even when closing our eyes, we can still see things if we are meditating as well, especially when zoned out. One can say this is mental consciousness, but these are clearly visual consciousness because they involve colors and shapes. What is the Buddhist explanation for this visual consciousness, as on the first glance, they seem to break the dependent origination formula in these? Well, the traditional or the orthodox Buddhist explanation would be mental. That if you're dreaming at night or you're just vividly imagining something, that would be mental. I mean, it would just be the sixth sense base, which is mind. Because really, nothing is impinging on the eye sensitivity. Which reminds me of two things. I got to digress. I can't just flat out give a straight answer and then move on to the next thing, which would cause these Q&As to be much shorter, I guarantee it. But I remember one time, a friend of mine, an American monk who is like me, is no longer a monk, asked me, when you close your eyes, what do you see? And like I just said, it's like seeing static on a TV screen, except with the contrast turned way down. And he said he talked to an Abhidhamma scholar, Burmese, of course, who said, nope, that's impossible. You have to see black. And so, because nothing's impinging on the eye, and it's like these dogmatic Buddhist scholars will reject their own experience in favor of what the book says. So just because the book says something doesn't necessarily mean that it's necessarily true, especially if it's in Abhidhamma commentaries. But there's also this phenomenon that I have experienced since I was a kid, and I can do it pretty much at will. And I would like any feedback from you if any of you have experienced something similar to this. Ever since I was a kid, if I can, with my eyes closed, if I just kind of adjust my focus in a certain way, which is hard to explain, you just kind of have to experiment with it, I see this field of ovals. They're like pink ovals, kind of, I don't know if you can see that, but it's like a pink oval or like a duck egg shape on a field of like turquoise blue. They're all in lines and they're all moving diagonally upwards and towards the left. They're all the same size, perfect. It's just geometrically perfect. So I assume that's not just my imagination. That's like something to do with the retina, like the optical aspect of the nervous system or something. And then there was another one that I could see when I was a kid. I haven't been able to see it in a long time. That was perfect circles red circles with like, it was just a red line. It wasn't solid red, just a red line circle on a black background with black in the middle, and they were also moving. I can't remember exactly the direction. I was a kid when I could see those, but it was just, you could see it perfectly. I mean, it wasn't reliant on imagination, because it was just geometrically perfect and always the same and always moving in the same direction at the same speed, which I don't know if, I assume because it's so concrete that other people must be able to experience this, but I've never really heard anybody talk about seeing pink ovals on a turquoise blue background, in rows moving slowly in a diagonal direction. But I can still do it. I mean, I just close my eyes and just kind of focus my vision a certain way with my eyes closed, and I can see it. And that would, I don't know what would be the official, I assume that might be optical, even though there's no object impinging. So maybe that would violate Buddhist philosophy right there. It might have to be just by default, just mental sensation, even though it does seem to be like the optical apparatus is involved because it's so clear and so geometrically perfect. It would have to be like some kind of artifact of, the retina or something. But just because you see something in the text doesn't mean that it's necessarily gospel truth with no possible exceptions. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Master Po. And Master Po says, of all the inventions in history, what's the best one? And the invention that comes to mind immediately was bread. I think bread was just, it was whoever came up with bread, especially leavened bread. That was great. But then again, I started thinking, well, that's prehistoric. That's not in history. I assume Master Po just meant over the course of human civilization, what's the best invention? In which case I would say, in my opinion, bread. But I mean, if it has to be historical, where the person who invented it and the year, that kind of thing, then I mean the wheel would be out, bread would be out. That's all prehistoric. So I don't know, maybe like the generation of electricity. I mean, electricity is a big deal. So maybe electricity. And I don't want to disappoint anybody, but I should have said, like meditation or something, but I don't know. Meditation doesn't have the same kind of effect on humanity as bread. I mean, in China, East Asians don't even understand bread. They don't get it. They think it's some kind of semi-sweet cake or something. But in the Western world, bread is just, the benefits of bread have pervaded. Nowadays, people say bread's junk food because, the genetically modified wheat or whatever, or the wheat is just, it's been produced, it's been like bred in such a, well, I shouldn't use the word bread in a different sense. It might confuse people. But, I mean, people are saying bread is junk food now, but still, bread, I've been a bread eater my entire life. I've descended from a long line of bread eaters, I think, and it just really suits me. It's just really nice. I like bread. But otherwise, maybe electricity. Electricity wasn't really invented, but like the generation of direct current or something. I don't know who did that. I'm pretty sure it was before Faraday. I think Faraday invented alternating current, but like direct current, where you've got magnets running through a coil of copper wire or something. Somebody had to come up with that. Sometimes I'm just amazed at just the brilliance of some of these early scientists that were, who would come up with the idea of running magnets through a wire, like a coil of copper wire, in order to why would they do that? Maybe they had this theory that maybe that would generate electricity, and so they tried it and it did. Anyways, I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Benjamin. And Benjamin says, it's looking more and more like the Jews, Christians, and Muslims are about to engage in mutually assured destruction. That said, do you have any regrets about moving back to the West? If the Asians are wise, they will sit this one out and come out on top. Seems to me like a good time to move to Asia. Well, I don't see how the Jews, Christians, and Muslims are any closer to mutually assured destruction than they were like in the 1960s. I mean, the Cold War was going full blast. We were at the brink of nuclear Armageddon several times at least during like the 1960s. You know, Cuban Missile Crisis, people thinking they're seeing like attacking missiles or bombers and almost pushing the big red button when really it turns out that it was a flock of geese or something. That happened several times. So I don't think we're really much closer to engaging in mutually assured destruction. Or if we do, it's going to be at such a scale that it's going to mess up the entire world and not just the Western Hemisphere and Europe. That, I mean, if there's like a thermonuclear Armageddon, the Chinese are going to be hurting just as bad as everyone else is. But let's just say that this civilization collapses. Let's say Western civilization collapses. What's going to happen in the East? China is just going to take over everything probably. And then I think I would prefer to take my chances in a collapsing Western civilization than move to the East and just become a subject of Chinese despotism. So, yeah, I mean, like Burma's certainly no utopia. I mean, Burma was one of the poorest. Under the British, it was the richest country in Southeast Asia. Almost immediately after getting independence, it became the poorest country in Southeast Asia. And Burma is just overflowing with natural resources. It's got pretty much untapped fisheries. It's self-sufficient with petroleum. It's got teak forests. It's got some of the best rubies in the world. They're set up. They got gold. They got jade. They're set up. They're not overpopulated. They got relatively fertile soil. There's no reason why Burma should be just a poor-ass country, and it is a poor-ass country mainly because that the government is just hopelessly incompetent. The Burmese just cannot organize. The only people in Burma that come close to being able to really organize is the military, which is one reason why the military keeps running the country. So, yeah, I have no delusions of like Southeast Asia being any kind of paradise. I mean, I lived in Indonesia for a few months. That seemed to be all right, but nah, I really don't think the Jews, Christians, and Muslims are going to engage in mutually assured destruction anytime soon. And if they do, the East is going to be screwed just as much as the West, probably. So, I guess I answered that question. I'm moving on to the next one. This is from Gordon. I'm checking to see how many hours we've been going at this. Less than 2 hours. This shouldn't be an extremely long one, although it'll be longer than the last one, I guess. So this one's from Gordon, and he says, I saw on some infographic a while ago that Myanmar does not use the metric system. What system do they use? Is it confusing? Did it cause you any trouble when you were over there? No, it didn't cause me hardly any trouble at all because they use the old English system of miles and inches and Fahrenheit. So, yes, Burma and the United States are two of the last remaining countries that still go with miles and inches and Fahrenheit and gallons. You know, just the old English system. Although the Burmese do kind of go farther than Americans do. Like on their highway, they've got, instead of every 10th of a mile, they've got every furlong, which I think is every 1/8 of a mile. They measure their mile markers go by furlongs, which is only used in horse racing in America, as far as I know. Also, they do have a few traditional units of measurement, like the petha, which is 3.6 pounds. So sometimes, like villagers especially, they'll measure something in pethas. I think a setha is 1/4 of a petha. So, I mean, they do have an old Burmese traditional, they do have those traditional units of measurement, but they're not used very much. And mostly they use the just the standard English measurement. And one weird thing about Burma is that they drive on the right side of the road the same as Americans do. But most of their cars have the steering wheel on the right side, so that the driver is like up against the side of the road, and you pretty much have to have somebody sitting in the passenger seat on the left side of the car to tell you when the coast is clear, when you can pass somebody. Because if you're driving by yourself, you've got to get way out, at least halfway out into the other lane just to see if it's clear. So needless to say, there's lots of wrecks in Burma. Plus, also, they just haven't had traffic there for very long, so that you've got these people that just don't know how to drive taken to the roads. They don't have well-established, like, what would you call it? Etiquette, road etiquette there. But that's not even part of the question, because I'm digressing constantly. Probably half of these Q&As are me just digressing about stuff. So I'm just going to move on to Gordon's next question, which is as follows. Based on some questions you answered a while ago, I got the impression that being a hermit was pretty well frowned upon in Buddhism. Monks are either in a monastery or within walking distance of a village. Is being isolated discouraged on purpose? If so, why? Well, no, isolation, viveka. Like Vivek Ramaswamy, viveka. Viveka means like solitude or isolation. It's very much encouraged. The problem is that monks were discouraged from being totally independent of lay people, that lay people should have some interaction with monks. They should be able to see monks. And so there is a rule that monks can't just grow their own food. They can't just pick fruit out of the trees and eat that. They do have to rely on lay people for the benefit of the lay people mainly. And so a monk does have to live within walking distance of a village, but that can be 5 miles. I mean, you're living 5 miles out into a forest, you're pretty much of a hermit if you're living out there by yourself, especially if you're discouraging visitors. So, yeah, I was pretty much of a hermit for most of the time that I lived in Burma, and, just discouraging visitors. I'd live in a cave. Sometimes I just wouldn't come out of the cave, even if people are wanting to see me. I just wouldn't come out. There were times when I just pee into a big bath cup or a plastic bag or something, just so I wouldn't have to go out and deal with the visitors waiting outside my cave. So, yeah, being a hermit is not frowned upon at all. It is strongly encouraged in Buddhism, but being a hermit doesn't mean that you have to live 20 miles away from the nearest human. I mean, 5 miles out into a forest, or even 2 miles out into a forest. I mean, if you're living by yourself, you're not dealing with other people, then you're pretty much of a hermit. If you're discouraging visitors, you're pretty much of a hermit. I've known hermits that were living on the outskirts of town. They just had like this fence around their place and just refused to open the gate. They'd go in there and stay by themselves. So the only exception to that is, like I said, you have to be within walking distance of a village so that you can get your food. And that's mainly out of compassion for lay people, that it really is a good thing for them to see renunciants. That was the 4th sign that triggered the Buddha's own renunciation, was seeing a robed renunciant that inspired him to find some other route, towards happiness. So it's also one of the blessings in the Mangala Sutta, the 38 blessings in life. One of them is seeing renunciants. So the Buddha did have some appreciation for that and did set things up so that monks couldn't just live completely alone and never see anybody. But, I mean, it does say in the text over and over again that even when a monk does come to the village, he shouldn't be striking up acquaintances in the village. He should just silently collect enough food and then just go back into his forest and eat it. So, yeah, I mean, walking distance of a village, that's not like disqualifying anybody from being a recluse. So I think I answered that one. So I'm just going to move on to Gordon's third question here, which is a follow-up question to the previous one. Is there any danger or at least hindrance to practicing if one is socially isolated? There can be danger to practicing if you're socially isolated, to the extent that, first of all, if you don't have a teacher, you're going to be like going from trial and error, just flying by the seat of your pants or flying by the seat of your sarong or whatever. So there is that. Also, if you're a recluse, you're living in isolation, you don't get feedback. So you can start drifting in eccentric directions and just keep drifting until you're just weird, maybe maladjusted, because you're not getting feedback from preferably a wise teacher, but even from other people, it can be beneficial. Like a hermit living alone, just the stereotypical hermit who lives alone is talking to himself all the time. And then he stops being a hermit, comes back into society, he's still talking to himself all the time. Nowadays, it's not that big of a deal. People think that you're just talking on the phone with like an earpiece or something. But so the texts do strongly encourage isolation, being socially isolated, opting out of society, go alone like the horn of the rhinoceros. But still, I mean, there's always going to be pluses and minuses to anything. There's going to be, potential drawbacks to any choice that you choose. So I think I answered that one. I'm moving on to the next one. This is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libralam, and he just informed me recently that he's thinking about changing his name again. So this is his name might take up several minutes at some point. But for the time being, he is Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libralam. And his first question is Buddhism as a path well outlined by speaking of its final goal as a kind of sadhu citta, or noble-mindedness? And I think if you want to say noble-mindedness, probably the more traditional rendering in Pali would be Arya Citta, because the word usually translated as noble into English is Arya, like the four noble truths, or the four Arya Satcha. The Noble Eightfold Path is the Arya Eightfold Path, the Arya Magga. So, yeah, let's see. I'll just start over here. Is Buddhism as a path well outlined by speaking of its final goal as a kind of sadhu citta, or noble-mindedness? I suppose, it would depend on the person. You can say that the goal is Arya Citta, or noble mind, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're enlightened. Why not just say liberation, like Vimutti, Vimokkha, or enlightenment itself, Bodhi? Why not just use a word like that? As the final goal, yeah, it'd be just the enlightened mind, the liberated mind. Noble mind isn't necessarily enlightened, but a liberated mind would be. So, for some people it might work, other people it might not work. And I'm just going to move on to the next question here. Also from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libralam, and possibly soon to be known as something else. Is there another Pali term that you would consider to be more choice? Oh, well, I already answered that one. Like Vimutti, Vimokkha, Bodhi, Nibbana, enlightenment. Or if you want to say noble-mindedness, you could say Arya Citta instead of Sadhu Citta. So, yeah, I guess I already answered that one. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libralam's third question. What are your thoughts on Miccha Vimutti, or wrong liberation, in the context of heretical ways of talking about enlightenment in the modern day, like with Daniel Ingram, Nelson Armstrong, I think, isn't it Delson Armstrong? And many other such Western practitioners? Wrong liberation. Well, if it's liberation, it's hard for me to think of a a kind of wrong liberation, unless it's just you think you're liberated when you really aren't. So that could be false or wrong liberation, is just the idea that you think you're liberated, which probably happens a lot in the West. People who claim to be enlightened that aren't just flat out deliberate frauds are nevertheless like overestimating what they have attained. And that could be called like micha vimutti. So what are my thoughts in the context of heretical ways of talking about enlightenment in the modern day, like with Daniel Ingram, Nelson or Delson Armstrong, and other such Western practitioners? My thoughts on wrong liberation in the context of heretical ways of talking. Well, some people, again, like some people may just overestimate what they've attained, and then that could be wrong liberation because they're really not liberated at all. They just think they are. Or it could be that you get into the kind of state, like some of these people who think that they're liberated, they're in a way they're glib. You know, they have a quick response to any objection, which in a way kind of makes them seem like they're speaking with authority, when really they're just glib or smug. You know, there's a lot of smug arhats in the West, it seems to me. So I'm not exactly sure how to answer this question, though. So I'm just kind of throwing words at the wall like spaghetti to see if it sticks. Let's see. What are your thoughts on wrong liberation in the context of heretical ways of talking about enlightenment in the modern day? Well, there's all different ways of talking about enlightenment. Like Eckhart Tolle talks about enlightenment in a certain way. Where he came up with the idea of women identifying with the pain body, I have no idea, since he's the only person that I've ever heard mention that. Yeah, I mean, some of their explanations of enlightenment seem to be legit. It may be just that they haven't lived up to that explanation. I mean, if you've got no attachments, then, I mean, regardless of the conduct of the person, that would be a fairly good explanation of enlightenment, even though they might still have attachments that they just aren't mindful enough to realize or whatever. So, yeah, this is just a hard question for me to fully wrap my head around well enough for me to be glib about it. In the context of heretical ways of talking about enlightenment. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how heretical Daniel Ingram and Nelson or Delson Armstrong and others, Eckhart Tolle, any number of people. There's another Ingram, a female Ingram, who is claiming to be enlightened also. That how heretical is their way of talking about, other than maybe them saying that you can still outwardly wallow in sensuality. That certainly would be unorthodox from a Theravada point of view. From a Theravada point of view, you have to be a saint in your morals before you can become enlightened, which I am personally skeptical of. I do think that a saint and a sage are not necessarily the same person. That really you can just transcend the whole phenomenal carnival, and still it's just nature taking its course, and an enlightened being wouldn't necessarily be enslaved to any kind of rules. Like Neem Karoli Baba up on the altar back there, he didn't follow rules. I think there's a good chance that he was fully enlightened. He was very highly advanced spiritually, definitely had psychic powers. But I mean, he did not follow rules. Certain rules, I mean, he was a strict vegetarian, I'm pretty sure. I don't think he ever ate meat. But, I mean, he would just yell and roar and laugh and cry and hit people and do all kinds of stuff that a stereotypical Theravada Buddhist sage just would not and even could not do. And that's something that's kind of bothered me about. You read in the text, like, an enlightened being can't do this and he can't do that, and he can't tell a lie. There's all these things he can't do, but I mean, you can say he just can't want to do that. It just doesn't even occur to him to even want to do that. But still, just putting all these limitations on a being who has transcended all limitations is I don't know. It's just kind of dubious to me. I'm not just flat out asserting one way or the other, but I do have a certain amount of healthy skepticism with regard to that. And I do think it's possible that someone like J. Krishnamurti may really have been fully enlightened, even though he didn't behave like an enlightened being is supposed to behave. Or Neem Karoli Baba up there. On the other hand, other people like Osho, formerly known as the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, some people think he was fully enlightened, and I'm fairly skeptical of that, just as I'm fairly skeptical of Daniel Ingram being fully enlightened, even though he just flat out asserts it, or at least used to, on his web. He's got a website, and right at the beginning of the website, he just declares himself an arhat. So, yeah, it's just a really kind of a weird situation where, I mean, a fully enlightened being might not even mean anything in a samsaric context. Within a samsaric context, there may be no fully enlightened beings. It might just be a kind of like a myth or something. And part of that is because, like, if you're unenlightened, if you look at an enlightened being, you're going to be looking at an enlightened being through unenlightenment colored glasses. And he's just going to seem like another unenlightened being. Or if an unenlightened person considers person X to be fully enlightened, that person X is just living up to some unenlightened idea of enlightenment that this unenlightened person has. So you look at the world through unenlightened glasses, all you're going to see is unenlightenment. You're not going to see a fully enlightened being. You might see some being that you have an unenlightened concept of enlightenment and you attribute that to that being, but you still don't get it. So, wrong liberation. It seems like any kind of liberation would be fairly good, unless it's liberation from something wholesome, I suppose. Liberation from like social standards of, being nice to people, that kind of thing, maybe. But I think mostly wrong liberation is people thinking that they're liberated when they're not. And it's not so much theoretical. It's just that they're overestimating what they've attained. Whereas any kind of concept of enlightenment would say, you got no more dukkha, at least. It might just be the semblance of dukkha, but still, you're free from just like, free from greed, hate, and delusion. Even though it might be that you still have a semblance of it, because that has just become irrelevant because you transcended it without eradicating it. So it's very tricky. And it's so tricky that I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Cherzaskaziz. And Cherzaskaziz says, today, if it is Saturday, and right now as I'm doing this, it's Saturday, although it doesn't get uploaded until Sunday. So I'll just start over. Cherzaskaziz says, today, if it is Saturday, in Catholic Church, it is the day of St. John of the Cross. Do you have any favorite chapters of books you especially recommend? Well, I don't know if I'd call them chapters of books that I especially recommend. Like The Ascent of Mount Carmel is an excellent book, but although no particular chapter stands out, it's just the whole book is good. So rather than single out just a chapter, I might single out one of his shorter works. Like, for example, he's got a poem called Stanzas Concerning an Ecstasy Experienced in High Contemplation. That is excellent. In fact, let's see, I got the book over here. Just a minute. Just so happens that I've got the collected works of St. John of the Cross right here. St. John of the Cross drew that picture too. He had a vision of Jesus on the cross, and he drew it because he was also a talented drawer. So, let's see. Stanzas concerning an ecstasy experienced in high contemplation. And then the refrain that keeps appearing is along the lines of, I entered into unknowing, and there I remained unknowing, transcending all knowledge. So that's a fairly brief poetical description of like high contemplation, like a jhanic state, which is it's interesting. It's very nice. Saint John of the Cross is the patron saint of Spanish poets. Also, there's a little collection of sayings of his called The Sayings of Light and Love, which is only a few pages long. It's sort of like proverbs. You know, so he'll give advice like, if somebody asks you for something that you have, you should give it even though you think you may need it later. That kind of thing. You know, don't expect it back, just give it. That kind of thing. Which is very saintly, uncompromisingly saintly. Most people wouldn't be able to live up to that stuff, but that's the way saints are. They're very uncompromising. There's a Catholic priest once told me that there's a saying in Catholicism that when one monk at a monastery becomes a saint, all the rest of the monks become martyrs. And that's just because saints can be such just fiercely uncompromising hard asses. So I'm just going to move on to Terzaskaz's second question, which is, what is the story about the picture of you holding a pizza as a monk? Yeah, I think it was a thumbnail on a previous Q&A, so I won't be able to use it for this Q&A, of me as a monk holding up a pizza. And somebody in upstate New York wanted to feed me, they wanted to donate a meal to me. And so they called a pizza place and had a pizza delivered. They paid for it with a credit card or something over the phone. It took them a while to find a pizza place that would take an order from New York, because I was in California at the time on the opposite side of the continent. But they had a pizza delivered to me. It was a good pizza too. And they wanted some kind of documentary evidence of me receiving the pizza. So I had a monk take a picture of me holding the pizza so I could send it to the guy in New York to show him, yep, here's me with the pizza. I got the pizza, by golly. It was a good pizza too. So that's the story. It's just somebody on the other side of the country wanted to donate a pizza to me, donate a meal. So they had a pizza delivered, and just to show them that I got the pizza, I had one of the Burmese monks take a picture of me holding the pizza. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred. And Fred says, is chasing Nibbana a fool's errand? Chasing Nibbana, you're going to eventually have to stop chasing it in order to attain it. Because like goal-oriented Dhamma, it can get you just so far, but it's not going to take you all the way. So whether it's a fool's errand or not, not necessarily. It may be necessary at first for like a beginner, even a person who is in intermediate stages, even fairly advanced in Dhamma. They can be chasing Nibbana. It's better to chase Nibbana than to chase your neighbor's wife or something, obviously. Certainly less of a fool's errand than that. But, eventually the goal-oriented stuff, you're going to have to let go. You have to let go of even your attachment for enlightenment. You have to let go of your ideal, because the ideal is going to be unrealistic. It's not really necessarily going to correspond with reality anyway. It's just not going to correspond with reality. An ideal and the reality, the real versus the ideal. That's the standard conflict that J. Krishnamurti talks about. So you got to let go of that, but it may get you a long way, get you fairly advanced before it's time to let go of it. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a fool's errand, but it's certainly not going to take you all the way. You're eventually going to have to let go even of that last attachment. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is the last question. And this is from Mumumax. I don't know if I pronounced his name correctly. Mumumax is not a particularly common name in American culture. So anyways, Mumumax says, is using black magic to unalive someone just as bad karmically as doing it to them in person? And the answer from Orthodox Theravada, from the point of view of Orthodox Theravada, is yes. For example, it is one of the 4 parajikas, one of the 4 offenses that if a monk breaks one of these rules, he is excommunicated for life. He's kicked out of the monkhood for the rest of his life. And one of them is murder. To kill another person that's it. That's parajika, you're excommunicated for the rest of your life. And these 4 rules, they're so important. They have to, like, in the texts, cover all the possibilities, because you got to be absolutely sure whether this monk is excommunicated or not. So, like with regard to stealing, they've got all these different theoretical cases about stealing. Like you're not allowed to steal anything worth more than a certain amount, like a coin called a pada. So what if a monk just steals a little bit every day that eventually adds up to a pada? Then that determines, whether that is parajika or not, is whether it's all part of the same plan or whether it's just like a fresh idea every time. That kind of thing. Or like if he starts to move it, how far does it have to move before it's stolen? If it's got legs, if like all 4 legs leave the ground, if I remember correctly, then that's parajika. If he just kind of tips it a little bit and then changes his mind and sets it back down, he's committed a lesser offense. So with regard to murder, there's certain things that a monk, it's just included under murder. One is just flat out killing somebody. You stab them or poison them or whatever. 2, you persuade them to commit suicide. That's right there in the rule, that persuading someone to commit suicide is the same as killing them. 3rd, like hiring a hitman, hiring an assassin, that's another one. And also like helping a woman to get an abortion, because in Theravada Buddhism, a human life begins at conception, which a lot of the Western lefties may reject, but they don't have the authority to change that. And another one is using magic. So if you kill someone with black magic, you've still killed them. The black magic is the weapon. So you're still just as guilty of murder if you use black magic to kill somebody. Although it's weird, like, let's say you're trying to kill person A, you shoot at them, and you accidentally kill person B because you're a lousy shot. You didn't aim good enough. Then you're not guilty of murder technically, because you were trying to kill person A and you failed. You accidentally killed somebody else, and to accidentally kill somebody is not the same as deliberate murder, at least from the point of view of ancient Indian Buddhist monastic discipline. Of course, they didn't have guns back then. Had bows and arrows, I guess. Or trying to poison somebody, the wrong person eats the poison. Again, if you're trying to specifically poison this person and then some other person eats that, then and the other person dies, the wrong person dies, then you're not guilty, you're not parajika, according to my understanding anyway. But yes, the short answer that I always avoid in these Q&A videos is using black magic to unalive someone just as bad karmically as doing it to them in person. Well, it's still murder. You're not off the hook by using some gimmick like black magic, just like you're not off the hook by using poison or something. But the karma may be different. The karma of killing someone from a distance, you don't even see them at the time. Like you're doing black magic rituals. It might be less violent, graphic kind of karma than if you're looking them right in the eye, just sticking the knife in and just killing them face to face. So, yeah, in a case like that, it might not be just as bad karmically. It's still bad. It's still murder, but different ways of murdering people are going to have different karmic qualities to them, which is a kind of problem in the modern world where you can have some coward sitting in a computer room launching cruise missiles, killing people that he doesn't see. They're not even a blip on a radar screen. He's just pushing the launch buttons and, hundreds of people are dying. And for him, it's just not that big of a deal as, like in ancient times, you're standing out on a battlefield with a sword or a spear, looking your enemy right in the eye and stabbing them and just feeling the first the resistance and then the give as the blade goes in and you see them gurgling and falling to the ground and all that. It's going to be a different quality of karma, even though you've killed them just as dead and you probably didn't kill nearly as many as the coward in the computer room launching cruise missiles. So there are definite differences in the karma, although the bottom line is you're still killing people and you're still making heaps of bad karma by doing it. From the Buddhist point of view, killing somebody is about the worst thing you can possibly do. It's like the worst possible karma you can do is killing. Although I think something like torture would be worse than just, some sort of instantaneous kill shot. But that's just me. And that's it. That's the last question of this Q&A. And like I should always say at the beginning, but rarely do, if you have any questions you think that I can maybe answer with regard to Theravada Buddhism, early Buddhism, meditation, Buddhist philosophy in general, Burma, myself in particular, anything like that, you think I could maybe answer it, or better yet, probably answer it, then include your questions in the comments below. If you have access to Subscribestar, you can ask me there. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask me there. No more than 3 questions per episode, please. And smash the like button. I mean, smash it gently. Don't just damage the computer or anything like that. And subscribe if you haven't already, and be happy. And I'm going to stop recording now.